Hey all, here OS Review. Some of you guys may have seen our coverage on the Nuu N20 from a couple weeks back, and I called it as one of the best value sub $100 unlocked Android smartphones that you can purchase for brand new, no pun intended. And for this price point, it was extremely competitive. I loved the design and commented on how I really enjoyed the metal frame as well as the fresh looking color. And one of the only cons I mentioned was the secondary camera lens was a macro 2 megapixel sensor, so you can get up close to some of your objects, but it's not super high res, and I wish an ultra wide angle lens or a telephoto zoom lens would have been there instead. But aside from that, it was a great showing, and what's really impressive is it looks like Nuu have actually listened to those comments, because we have a bit of a treat today in that we're checking out the N20. You can also think of this as the N10 Pro edition, because they've unveiled even more colors continuing with this theme, and borrowing the design language of the N10, it's still crafted out of alloy metal materials for the frame, feeling extremely sturdy for a budget phone like this. And now you can find it in shades such as blue, as well as this very subtle green. And by the way, all of the metal chassis frame are also color accented as well. And this one reminds me of a grapefruit in color. It's a subtle shade in between pink and red, and also looks quite attractive and vibrant. Not to mention the classic purple colorway is also available. This is a shade that we have seen on some of their other phones in the past, such as on the A15 as well as the N30, although the texture here is matte and maybe pops a little bit more in terms of the color being slightly brighter. So it's pretty cool to see such a large variety of colors available. I don't think I've seen something like this since the iPhone 5C series from so many years ago. Definitely miss the days where manufacturers were a bit more playful with their smartphone design, and this kind of reminds me of that golden age. And it retains many of the attributes that we liked from the N10, including the built-in stereo speakers, a clean version of Android without any bloatware pre-installed, as well as an integrated fingerprint scanner that feels quite fast and responsive. We now have an ultra-wide-angle 8 megapixel lens. This is a lot more practical in my opinion compared to the 2 megapixel macro. So you gotta love a company that actually listens to feedback and tries to actively improve, giving us what we actually want to see. That being said, still keep in mind that this is a budget phone at the end of the day. It's not meant as a flagship device, but within the context of around $100 to $150, I do think this is a great showing. Some additional upgrades compared to the N10 also include RAM. It now includes 6 GB compared to 4 gigs on the base N10, also improving on the multitasking performance. That being said, the phone is still using the same processor as the N10, which is the Unisoc T606 octa-core chip. Performance is relatively close to the MediaTek Helio G81, as well as some of the prior Qualcomm Snapdragon 600 series chips. So for everyday navigation, as well as web browsing, media consumption, it still does a pretty good job, able to drive the 90 Hz refresh rate of the screen to make it feel still quite fluid and fast. But if you are pressing it really hard, doing things like intensive gaming, then you'll be better served with a higher end device. But I still stand by my assessment that it's really impressive that you don't have to really spend an arm or a leg anymore to get a more than usable enough experience, providing a surprisingly polished design and build, as well as a smooth enough performance to handle the basics. So diving a little bit deeper into the design, again compared to the N10, it is almost completely identical, which is definitely not a bad thing. Even the alloy rails here are slightly curved off on the edges, reminiscent of the much more expensive iPhone 16 series. So even though it's a flattened design, if you're holding it, it still is quite comfortable, doesn't really cut into your hands. There is a very tactile volume rocker / power key fingerprint scanner, all made out of metal, and the Type-C port here charges at 18 watts, the same speed as the N10, juicing up the 5,000 mAh capacity battery in around an hour and a half. The large capacity here ensured roughly 2 days of use before I had to really recharge it again, and you also find a hybrid dual SIM card configuration, so you can pop in 2 nano SIMs, alternatively use the second SIM card slot to hold a micro SD card to augment the 128 GB of built-in storage. And you can also find on the top a standard 3.5mm headphone jack, always great to see. The phone also has built-in Bluetooth 5 if you want to connect to wireless headphones and speakers, plus the built-in stereo set. Areas that remain unchanged, however, include the screen, which is still 6.56 inches diagonally. It is an IPS LCD panel with decent enough viewing angles and an HD Plus resolution. Yes, a full HD Plus screen would be even better, but honestly, if you're just looking at the phone from a normal distance, the colors are more than accurate enough. Again, feeling a little bit smoother than expected thanks to the faster 90 Hz refresh rate of the screen. The phone also continues to employ a 5 megapixel front-facing selfie camera using a hole punch cutout, so the resolution on this front-facing lens hasn't really changed. It's just the rear cameras that have seen an upgrade in the form of a higher resolution 16 megapixel lens compared to 13 megapixels for the primary camera on the N10, so a little bit sharper with more details that you can zoom into, plus having an ultra-wide angle camera now instead of a macro lens. We still find the presence of built-in FM radio, although a couple of premium extras like IP water resistance rating as well as NFC are still omitted on the N20. If you want those, you have to still pay a little bit more for one of their more premium offerings, such as the B30 5G, which, by the way, again, the N20, because of that T606 chip, is still a 4G LTE device, but again, unlocked, so it should work with many carriers globally, including GSM ones like T-Mobile here in the US, Tello, and other MVNOs. And when you're traveling internationally, you can just pop in another SIM card to get up and running. As far as packaging contents are concerned, you still have the same in the box as you get from the N10, which is a good thing. They give you all the essentials to get up and running, inclusive of TPU rubber case for the phone, making the device a little bit easier to grip, also protect the screen from scratching if you're lying it face down, for instance. Although, to be honest, since the phone's rear is made of this matte texture instead of glass, it's actually not super slippery. Even if you're using it naked, it already feels quite solid. You also find a quick start guide, some stickers, a SIM ejector pin, as well as the 18-watt charger plus a USB Type-C cable is also included. So it continues to remain ironic that you get more with a budget phone than a premium phone these days. Many don't even give you a charging cable in the box anymore. And by the way, the phone also comes with a factory pre-applied screen protector as well. Now, taking a closer look at the software experience, it is pretty much copy and paste from the N10, although that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's very clean. You don't have much bloatware on here aside from the Google Essentials, including the Play Store pre-installed. There's also a kind of help app to quickly contact support if you have any questions, since this company, by the way, does have offices located in the US. So it could be a nice alternative to brands like Poco, as well as Xiaomi, Redmi, which have a heavier presence in Asia, and you may have to import those devices, making support a little bit more tricky depending on where you're located, so just keep that in mind. There's also a basic sound recorder app from Nuu that we'll take a look at in a moment, and if we jump into more advanced settings, some custom features that they've added include a scheduled power on and off feature, so if you want the phone to turn on and off automatically at certain times in the day, you might find that automation helpful. There's also more display properties, including different colors and contrasts that you can adjust, such as making the screen a little bit warmer versus cooler, depending on your preferences. So you get that customization, as well as a kind of HDR profile that you can switch on to make the colors just pop a little bit more when you're consuming videos, in addition to change the screen's refresh rate, so you can dial it down to something like 60 Hz to consume less power, or I like to keep it on to 90 Hz to make it feel a little bit more smooth as you're swiping through the UI. As for smart controls, you still get the double tap to wake functionality on the phone's display as well, a feature also found on more premium smartphones, as well as some motion controls that you can use to flip the phone screen around to mute incoming calls as well as alarms, in addition to activate a pocket mode to prevent any accidental triggers when the phone isn't being used. And by the way, they also have a proximity light sensor here as well, so it can automatically change the screen's brightness based on the environment you're in. It's a sensor that not all ultra-budget phones have, so it's great to see that present here. Also, if you don't like the gesture navigation method, you can return back to the button navigation mode instead, so this might be helpful if you're also giving this to perhaps an elderly or to the child as a backup device. In fact, if you prefer the navigation bar mode, they give you additional customization as well to switch the orientation of the buttons around, additional customization controls including using 3 fingers to drag down and capture a screenshot, as well as what you want to trigger when long pressing on the power key, either the assistant or reverting back to the traditional power menu instead. Like the N10, you're able to borrow 4 GB of the system's storage to act as virtual simulated RAM, so combined with 6 gigs of physical RAM, you can get upwards of 10 GB total, which again might be helpful if you are trying to run a little bit more complex applications and jump back and forth, keeping things still open in the background. So it's quite familiar compared to what we saw from before, but still provides you with, I think, a decent amount of customization on top of a relatively clean version of Android 14 out of the box. That being said, as a really affordable Android smartphone, again, that N10 was only around $80 when on sale, We don't really anticipate it getting too much additional OS level upgrades. Unfortunately, that's still one compromise on a more affordable device in general, and you can still install all the latest applications from the Google Play Store. Plus, to be completely honest, I have personally found that the last couple of OS upgrades from Android have been more incremental than ever before. For instance, going from Android 14 to Android 15, I could actually barely tell. When I tried it out on a Google Pixel, I actually at first wasn't sure that I was even using Android 15 or not. The point being, compared to the early days of Android, where every single OS variant, such as going from Android 3 to 4 or 5, there were much more significant jumps in between those OS versions that you would be missing out on. But as the platform matures, until there's a big overhaul at least, you're getting smaller and smaller perceivable differences. Obviously, more OS upgrades would be even better, but it is what it is, and there is still at least support that you're able to readily contact if any kind of questions come up. We can also drag down here to access the quick notification shade, for instance intelligent captions, power saving mode, screencasting, as well as an ultra power saving mode can also be triggered. This gives you only the essentials such as making calls, as well as 3 other applications that you can program to prolong the battery life even more. But again, the 5000 mAh cell was generally quite satisfactory, so even for longer work days, it will still survive without too many problems. Here's also a quick test of the microphone quality. So we are recording using the mic now, test 1, 2, 3, also providing an example of what you can expect out of the phone call quality as well. Using the mic now, test 1, 2, 3. Pretty crisp when it comes to audio pickup. Reception quality likewise fared quite well, similar to the N10. There are a couple of embedded antenna lines on the metal chassis, but whether it was T-Mobile or using dual band Wi-Fi, I was getting around 3 to 4 bars quite consistently, so didn't really encounter any disconnections or loss of signal either when using it for communication as well as connecting to the internet, which is also good because again that metal design might also harken memories of the iPhone 4 and the whole antenna gate situation where if you're holding the phone in a certain way it drops signal. Luckily that's not something that I encountered on this device. Now let's also take a quick look at the camera next. From first glance the UI looks almost identical to the N10. You still have access to HDR as well as you can turn on and off AI scene detection to change some of the colors and contrast if you're pointing at different scenes like food versus landscape versus a plant, for instance, and you can use that in conjunction with HDR to add a bit more detail in the shadow regions. There's still built-in Google Lens support, so you can scan in objects as well as barcodes from here, and there's also a beauty mode that you can use to smoothen out some of the skin imperfections, plus a handful of different scenes that you can apply directly without editing it in post. Really the only difference is by default it will be shooting in 16 megapixels compared to 13 megapixels found on the N10's slightly lower res camera. And also on the bar here you have a tab dedicated for the ultra wide angle lens compared to the macro lens. So just to serve as reference, here's the primary camera, and now switching into the ultra wide, still sitting in the same spot, we're able to see just a little bit more within the frame of the shot. So you don't have to stand as far back, and it's actually quite useful when you're capturing landscape shots. That being said, again 8 megapixels is still a little bit lower res compared to that primary lens if you are doing a lot of zooming and cropping, but at 100% scale as you're looking at the image it still is not bad, and again I do find it to be more practical compared to the 2 megapixel macro from the other setup. So I'll gladly take this, although the ultra wide angle lens no longer has the HDR as well as AI scene detection modes that you get on the primary lens. Under more, you can also shoot video using the ultra wide angle lens as well. Both lenses by the way are capped at 1080p full HD resolution, but I think that's still decent for a phone in this price range. You also get a manual mode for adjusting properties like ISO, white balance, as well as metering, a portrait mode that uses that secondary camera actually to still collect some depth information so you can blur out objects in the background, a panorama mode if you want to stitch together multiple shots for even wider perspectives, and the usual special effects of slow motion, time lapse, as well as a night mode. Increasing the exposure time to let in more light, it can also be found. That being said, both of those cameras still do not come with optical image stabilization, which I guess is expected for this price range, but just something to keep in mind. You have to hold a little bit more still as you're shooting in darker environments, and obviously the consistency of the camera is not going to beat what an iPhone or Pixel can deliver, particularly with some of the computational processing. But again, keep in mind the price range that this phone is sitting in. You can pick up all of the colors for an entire family, and that would still be half as much as you'd pay for a single Pro Edition iPhone. So keeping in mind that huge delta in price, I think it still is doing good enough and punching above its weight class. Otherwise, you can tell that when we are zooming in, I'm still seeing sufficient details. Here's also an instance of it handling a plant scene using the AI detection, adding a bit more contrast and pop, similar on some Samsung Galaxy smartphones. And also, even though you no longer get that 2 megapixel macro camera, the primary lens can still focus up close quite well. When combined with a bit of cropping and zooming, you can honestly get a pretty similar effect as that dedicated macro lens in the past. So I didn't find myself missing that at all because the primary camera could already focus up close without too many issues. Here we have an example of the primary 60 megapixel lens compared to the same spot. This is the ultra-wide angle lens, so you can see a few more trees here on the corners. A touch of lens distortion that curves off maybe a bit here, but it's not bad, getting a more dramatic perspective. But again, that primary lens just has a little bit more detail, as well as HDR maybe helping some of the colors a little bit more. So all in all, I would say compared to the N10's camera setup, that primary lens, the difference between 13 megapixels and 16 isn't going to be necessarily night and day, and both phones have comparable performance on the main shooter when it comes to HDR and AI scene detection. The color science is pretty much the same. It's just you can maybe zoom in a hair more with a couple more megapixels. The biggest difference though is the presence of that ultra-wide angle lens, which is a more significant upgrade in my opinion. Generally, it's a camera that works well enough for this budget price range. Now moving into a quick video consumption as well as speaker test. Alright, so turning things down there, the added stereo separation just makes content feel a little bit more immersive as you're consuming videos, and it's actually quite enjoyable for things like YouTube and Netflix. That being said, if you are really nitpicking, yes, the top speaker might be a touch weaker or less loud compared to the bottom one, so there's a slight channel imbalance, but all in all, it's still better than having just a single mono speaker in my opinion, plus you have that standard headphone jack and Bluetooth connectivity to further augment that experience. As we touched on earlier, even though this is an HD Plus resolution screen, I think it still is doing quite well here from the perspective of color, generous enough viewing angles, and brightness wasn't too problematic unless you are in glaring direct sunlight. For most shaded regions or indoors, I think it still is more than satisfactory enough, and the panel is fully laminated, so there is no gap between the glass and the LCD underneath either, so offers not too much glare and reflections as you are generally tilting around and looking at it. Scrubbing between parts of the video, as you can tell here, is also not going to be that problematic, thanks to decent enough antenna reception quality as well. Again, the T606, as we talked about, I think is actually a processor that, like the story of this phone, is punching above its weight class. Echoing remarks from the N10 from earlier, it's doing a lot better than I expected when it comes to just general navigation, rarely missing a beat when you're swiping between screens, as well as having a couple of apps open there in the background, like YouTube consumption, still feeling surprisingly quite smooth. And that story continues with web browsing as well, when loading back web pages like The Verge, which is a bit more complex. In fact, we can even request the desktop version of the site, and you can tell that it just takes a split second here for it to load, but there's plenty of different ads as well as scrolling elements on the page, embedded videos, and it still is a more than serviceable enough experience. Plus the additional RAM on the N20 compared to the N10 means that we can now just jump back and forth between a couple more open tabs before anything has to reload in the background. So reiterating our remarks from earlier, again, the T606, the compute performance in here plus the RAM, I think is actually doing a very capable job for handling the basics. Unlike just a couple of years ago where a budget phone would feel noticeably choppy and slow, sometimes leaving you feeling frustrated as you're using it, this is really no longer the case because you are essentially getting the compute performance of a mid-ranger from years past, now at the price point of a really budget phone. So I think that is the most impressive part, how usable a device in this price range has become. And as for doing a little bit of gaming here and there, as you can tell, overall it's really not bad from the perspective of it can handle a lot of these casual titles, tap and go style, without too many problems. So even as you are gaming for slightly longer sessions, it gets a little bit warm at the back region but never too hot, and consistency seems to be decent enough. Obviously, if you are a competitive gamer and you want the fastest frame rates 24/7 in AAA style games like Asphalt series or PUBG, then you probably have to still pay more for a phone with a faster processor and GPU, but for casual gaming, I would say this is still getting the basics done more than well enough. There are no titles as well as apps, including social media, productivity, and reading tools that you aren't able to run on this phone. Everything is still actually keeping up quite well as long as you give it a split second longer, maybe during the initial loading, again keeping realistic expectations at the end of the day. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the Nuu N20, and like we said at the beginning of this video, you can also think of this as the N10 Pro because it keeps the really elegant, minimalistic design language that I loved on the N10, but now upgrades on some of the components, such as having more RAM, a more practical secondary camera setup on the rear, but also retains the low price point as well as that main processor inside. But what's impressive is it shows Nuu are aware of their strengths as well as are actually actively listening to some of the feedback and just improving on those small aspects incrementally. So this is actually quite an exciting showing, and once again presents itself as an excellent value super budget Android smartphone, which is surprisingly well built, stylish, and handles the basics well. So as long as you're not comparing it directly to a device that is 5 or 10 times the price, within the segment that this device is sitting in, I think it is quite impressive. You can check out more details if you are interested in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Again, an excellent super budget phone that has been the Nuu N20.